This is audio 4. So I'm trying to split this up. The first 19 slides, if this were a normal class or the classroom and people I could see, then the first set of 19 slides there would have been the first session of the class, the first hour and a half or hour and 50 minutes. And this one would be the second one for the week. So that's how we're doing it. I'm looking at slide 20. Let's go on to slide 21. So to get into a little bit of detail about Chinese influence on its periphery in traditional times before the West intruded and turned everything upside down, we can look at Chinese influence in Korea and Vietnam. I want to examine these because they are, I don't know if I'd say extreme examples, but they are very good examples of Chinese influence penetrating practically all of the upper levels of society, at least. But there is a difference between them. In Korea, there was much more acceptance of China's influence, and there's a good reason for that, because it was much harder to resist. Everybody does what's easy in this life, and everybody tends to avoid things that are impossible, and indeed, even today, it's impossible for the North Koreans to avoid Chinese influence. They put up some resistance. The North Koreans don't do everything the Chinese say, and indeed lately there's been some evidence that the North Koreans are, perhaps unwisely, striking out on their own path, but I don't think that will last. It is simply, China is simply too big and too powerful to ignore for the North Koreans, particularly since China is not going through a difficult period of weakness. If it were a difficult period of weakness, that would be a wholly different story. And such a period came when the Japanese ascended in Asia, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the use of the Chinese language by both the Koreans in traditional times and by the Vietnamese was similar. It was also, that language was also used by the elites in Japan, and you were not considered to be an educated person unless you had learned it, because knowledge of written Chinese was necessary in order to read the Confucian classics, that is, Confucian as in Confucius, and if you had not read those classics, you were not eligible to even be considered for an official position, and therefore you were relegated to a lower set of classes, to a lower economic status and social status in society. So there was plenty of incentive to learn Chinese for people who had the leisure time, in other words, the money, to train their children to do so. And that examination system, which existed in China, was transplanted into Korea and Vietnam, to a lesser extent in Japan. And you'll find that today, if you travel to Korea, South Korea, Chinese characters are still used in newspapers. They are not, and they're transplanted from Chinese to Korean, because Korean, again, is not a Sinitic language. It is not in the same family group linguistically as Chinese. It's a Turkic language. So the words that are Chinese words that have been brought into Korean have a Chinese sound. For example, Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, that's Pyongyang in Korean, is Pingyang in Chinese. And there are lots of other examples, such as another place I once lived called Pyeongtaek. That's Pyeongtaek in South Korea. In Chinese, it's Pingde. So there's a similar sound because the words have actually been translated, transliterated from Korean into Korean from Chinese, and they've kept the same sort of sound over the generations. But Korea has purely Korean words as well, which are not expressed in Chinese. They're expressed in the Korean alphabet. So a South Korean paper is a mixture of the Korean alphabet and Chinese characters. The North Koreans have done away with Chinese characters, not because they were anti-Chinese, but because they wanted to advance literacy. It's just harder to learn to read if you have to learn Chinese characters. The Vietnamese also did the same thing. They not so much because of a socialist ethic, but because the French replaced their language with Vietnamese, because the problem with using Chinese characters was that you could not have every word in your language represented by a Chinese character if it wasn't Chinese. So the Vietnamese did this as well, and you don't find Chinese characters in a Vietnamese newspaper today. This strong influence was a little bit different, though, in Vietnam, because Vietnam has geographic advantages to defense. To take a quick look at that, all you have to do, again, is go to Wikipedia and search on 1979 and war and China and Vietnam, and you'll see a decent description of what happened when China tried to invade Vietnam in 1979, something we'll get into in later weeks of this course. The Chinese had their noses bloodied, partly because their army was not quite up to snuff compared to the recently combat-tested Vietnamese army, but also because the terrain was not conducive to an invasion. However, the terrain in Korea is very conducive to an invasion from China. Big disadvantage, and one reason why Koreans with brains over the centuries have given in to the inevitable and have done everything they could to get along with China. I'm being very blunt here and very general in my remarks, but what I'm saying is basically true. I'm saying Koreans with brains because there's no evidence quite yet that Kim Jong-un, the new leader of North Korea, has one. But anyway, let's go on to slide 22. So Tibet, a completely different story. Why is Tibet such a different story? Again, geography figures in. Take a look at the film that I've inserted into the course content for this week about Tibet, and you'll see, you'll get a hint about what it's like to try to walk into Tibet. It is absolute hell. I've taken a couple treks in Tibet, and I'm in my 50s, and I'm in pretty good shape. I went there with my two sons, who are your age. I was a bit of a snail on the trail compared to my two sons, who were both in very good shape. However, even they found the going to be not all that easy at times, particularly once we got above about 13,000 feet or 14,000 feet. It's difficult to bring a lot of people into Tibet to do anything. And that's why when Chinese regimes have been weak, they have left Tibet alone. When they've been strong, except for the most recent era, they've mostly left Tibet alone anyway. All they've done is arrange to have governments in place that do not give them a bunch of trouble. And why are Chinese regimes interested in the first place in Tibet? Well, that's because if China is weak, and Tibet is left to develop a power vacuum of sorts. Either you get an independent Tibetan government that cannot be relied on to keep foreigners out, or you get foreign influence. You face the possibility, as Goldstein says in the reading for this week, of having the British looking down over China's most populated rice belt areas in Sichuan and elsewhere. And Chinese governments didn't want that. However, this concern by Chinese governments of foreign influence only developed in the Qing dynasty. You'll read in Goldstein that there really was not much Chinese interest about Tibet before the Qing, and we can explore that in the next slide, slide 23. So it was the Mongolian invasions of the Genghis Khan era in the late 12th century that changed everything. Before this, there was virtually no Chinese interest in Tibet at all. After this, the Chinese paid attention because the Mongols developed a special relationship with Tibet, which was significant as long as Mongol power was significant too. If you have taken a course on Chinese history in ancient times, you'll be aware of the Yuan dynasty, that's spelled Y-U-A-N, the Yuan dynasty, otherwise known as the Mongol dynasty, which took over all of China, and they took over Tibet at the same time. However, the Tibetans did not invite invasion and bloodshed. They basically surrendered and said that we will take care of your interests in two ways if you don't invade. One is that we will not allow other people into our sphere of influence here that borders on yours. And the other is that we will set up a priest-patron relationship with you. And this was a credible offer to make because the Tibetans at this time were the center of religious learning for the variety of Buddhism that is prevalent in Mongolia. The two are quite close, both linguistically and culturally. So this priest-patron relationship developed. Let's go on to, which is in the readings, let's go on to slide 24. So the Ming Dynasty, from 1368 to 1644, pretty much allowed this to continue. They ended up with a relationship of I can't think of the word. They accepted each other's spheres of influence with the Mongolians. There was a rapprochement of sorts that lasted for a long time. There were problems, but for the most part, they did not make war against each other. They simply coexisted, sometimes uneasily. And so there was less worry on the part of the Chinese about the different warfare that could bring instability to Tibet that existed in the 15th and 16th centuries between the two major sects of Tibetan Buddhism, the Red Hats and the Yellow Hats, because the Mongolians basically kept things from getting out of control, and there was an accommodation with Mongolia. So this did not pose a problem for China during that period until the Qing dynasty, and the details again are in the readings, of fairly short and well-written reading by Goldstein. Let's go on to the next slide, slide 25. When the Qing took over, however, in 1644, things began to change. And the reason for this was that the Mongols, there are two major groups of the Mongols. There are the Mongols in the east and the Mongols in the west. And it's these Mongols in the west, the Dzungar, who are ethnically overlapped with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They're pretty much from the same, not only ethnic, but cultural stock. And their defeat at the hands of the Qing in 1696 and the extermination campaign that the Qing pursued after that in the mid-1700s. Again, this is the 18th century. Don't get that mixed up when you write papers. Don't say the 18th century when you mean the 1800s, because the 18th century is the 1700s. I'm only saying this because I keep seeing it in papers. When the Qing pursued their decades-long effort to subdue and exterminate large numbers of the Dzungar people, who today are pretty much the same people that are in Xinjiang, this underlined a problem that they needed to worry about making sure that Tibet was also under their control. Now, Xinjiang and Mongolia. Xinjiang, which you'll see on a map of China in the far west, is quite easy to invade from China. It's not shielded by mountains as much as is Tibet. It is not at an awfully high altitude, as is almost all of Tibet. Xinjiang is easy to get into and get out of. And so at all times, practically, of China's history, there have been at least parts of Xinjiang that have fallen under Chinese control. Not true of Tibet, because, again, Tibet is hell to get into and hell to get out of because of its majestic mountains and its very high altitude, even inside those mountain ranges. So it's easier to invade from China than is Tibet. But at the same time, Tibet is easier to invade from China than anywhere else. So that means that it's the Chinese who, if anybody's going to dominate Tibet, it's likely to be China. Let's go on to slide 26. So as time moved on, as the Dzungar Mongols became a problem and were suppressed, the Qing became more interested in controlling Tibet because they now began to face problems, potential problems from India, because the British had taken over. Previously, India, before the British took over, was split up into many different kingdoms. It was not any sort of geopolitical threat to Tibet or China, but when the British took over, that was a different situation. The British were interested in Tibet, as you'll see in the short film that is on D2L, because of their geopolitical competition with Russia. They were afraid the Russians would come in, dominate Tibet as China grew weaker and weaker, and threaten British India. And of course, the British and the Russians were not on the best terms during this period. So there you are. So the Chinese began a long campaign of reducing Tibetan territory as much as possible, so that the Dalai Lama and his government in Lhasa were not in control of these places you see that are not colored yellow, Amdo and Kham in particular, and they began to pursue a policy of making sure that the Tibetans were loyal only to Peking or Beijing and not loyal to anybody else. I'll stop here. We'll go on to slide 27.